I'm going to do some theory.
Then I will have to turn this around.
It's kind of like it's the easiest to explain to people. Yeah, it is. It's like the easiest behaviors.
Like trying to get you all in the shot.
Okay.
Yeah, trying to get you like all in the shot. You can get 4, but not 5. Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh.
There we go.
You could probably have the interview and so that if there are any members of GAU who don't speak English, that they're still able to gather. That could be like,
Great,
that
now
could
my
actually
face is
expand
like
to be
totally
more
in it.
inclusive for people who don't want to have to go through in their heads, like translating English heavy information.
So I'm just
also
gonna.
not an interpreter.
That's true. Then you have to do all of it. Okay, never mind. I was just, I had a moment. I was just like, yes. And I was like, oh. Don't do that. I didn't say it.
No, it's not. Yes, yes, yes.
I honestly don't
I don't
know.
know either. The thing is, like, as far as if people have questions afterwards.
We can do that and post it on the social media post. We can also have them go email organizing, and we'll forward them to everybody. Cool. All right. I'm ready if y'all are. Post the Zoom link, and hopefully the recording's working as well. It says pause and stop recording. So that's encouraging.
Yeah, I'm a 5.
I'm with you.
I guard
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and actually, we need time for Q&A as well. So we'll probably talk for no more than an hour. And then at least 15 minutes for a Q&A wrap-up, depending on the time. Yeah. Okay.
Ready?
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Shay Williams. I am the chair member and committee member of Life and Mental Health Committee at GAU. And I'm here today with some of my fellow counselors for our active therapist panel. So if you would briefly just introduce yourselves and share whatever you would like others to know about.
Hi, my name is Corinne Buchanan. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, and I am finishing off this very first year of my PhD program in counseling and counselor education. I'm going back to school so that I'll be able to teach other individuals how to become counselors. My background includes crisis counseling as well as private practice experience.
Hi everyone, my name is Nia Page. I am a registered mental health counselor intern with the state of Florida. I'm also roughly 1 semester away from finishing my first year in the doctoral program in counseling and counselor education. In terms of clinical background, college counseling, some crisis work. I really enjoy working with marginalized folks and communities of color. So that typically tends to be my population focus.
Hi, I'm Gina Norcross, pronoun she, her, and I am also in the 2nd semester of the counselor education doctoral program, and I am a registered marriage and family and mental health counseling intern for the state of Florida. I do a combination of community and private practice work. I work with children from like children ages 3 all the way to adults, middle adults. And I am a systemic thinker, and I do a lot of systemic work. So working with families, working with relationships, working with couples. I also like to do a lot of identity work and identity development, and trauma tends to be another one of my focuses.
Hello everyone, my name is Isabel Rayo. I am from Mexico City, and now I am studying here at the University of Florida. I am in the 5th semester of the PhD. I have been working since 14 years ago with individuals, families, and couples. My theoretical orientation or approaches are systems and postmodern therapies. I also study psychoanalysis, but I don't really practice psychoanalysis. It is just more something fun that I really like to learn. Well, there are so many fun things that I really like to learn, but yes, well, I am here now in the United States.
Thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm Shay, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in Florida. I've been in the field for about 5 years, and I specialize in trauma. I've worked in the past with at-risk teenage girls in the community, and I've also worked at an inpatient facility for substance use disorders. So my intentions of creating this panel was to kind of answer some common questions that people have about therapy, like what it is, how to access it, and probably ask some of the more common questions that the mental health committee gets. And then at the end, because it is Ask a Therapist, we'll open up the floor for Q&A at the end if anyone has any questions. So I'd like to start with the most common one that we get, which is just, how do you find a therapist?
I think that the best way to find a really good therapist or something that is going to be a good fit for you is for a recommendation. Almost all my clients, or I would say the 90% of my clients, they have arrived because the friend or the family said, go with Isabel, and they will be sure that the resource is going to be, or the therapist is going to be a really good fit and reliable, I would say.
So mostly word of mouth, like asking around the people that you trust to make this happen, good recommendations. Okay.
I know that like the traditional Psychology Today online is one of the platforms, but recently some therapists, particularly outside of Canada, created a new website called therapyden.com, which is really focused on the counselor as a human, or like the therapist as a human, and being with humans in the world with like marginalized and intersectional identities, talking more openly, like that being a part of the platform, like when you're searching for your personal, like a person that you want to work, maybe if you don't have word of mouth or like as reliable of resources around you, so you can access someone who's more allied with identities or like ideas that you align with and things like that. So I like that as an alternative option for searching for a therapist.
Yeah. I also, if I could, another resource, inclusivetherapist.com, is one of my favorite resources. It's the database is only providers that identify as a BIPOC person or a QTPOC person. So if you really want to work with someone that's not only affirming, but can also like have shared identity with you as a client, that's another website and resource that has a really, really fruitful database of providers.
Yeah, that was inclusivetherapist.com.
Yes.
I actually was not aware of that resource.
Yeah.
Oh, me. So for this question, I have like a lot of answers that come up around it, because I agree that word of mouth can be one of the best ways to find a therapist who you may have a greater likelihood of being a good fit with. And also want to hold space for like the privilege around that of being able to necessarily afford services for therapists within the community, depending on where they're at and whether or not your insurance will line up. So I also do want to point out that one of the ways to find a provider can be like calling your insurance company and saying like, who is covered? Who is in network? Who can I see? Right?
Yeah.
The other piece that was coming up for me is that it often depends on presenting concerns. The specific thing that was coming to mind for me was looking at obsessive-compulsive behaviors and those kinds of pieces where that may require a more specialized therapist, somebody who has specific training in that, or a therapist who work with autism, or a therapist who work with individuals with ADHD, that like, if you know that there are pieces that you have identified for yourself, not necessarily diagnosed yourself, but like, hey, this is something that's coming up for me, being able to then search out therapists and resources that are specifically catered to and designated for you, because it's going to make sure that the person that you're working with is educated in the area that you need.
You made me think of another resource as well when you're talking about the privilege and like economic pieces of that. The Open Path Collective is another resource online that therapists register for, that they provide like a very low sliding scale. So I'm not sure that as the questions come, Shay, average therapy costs across the country for a 50-minute session is between 100 to 150 plus an hour. And it is well outside the range of what most people can afford, especially people who need it the most. So on OpenPath, therapists sign up and they register and say, like, I'm offering to provide a sliding scale for individuals and couples therapy for at the $30 to $60-ish range for individuals, and I think it's like 40 to 80 for couples therapy. So it does allow for an access point. I've worked with many clients through that, and you can do through telehealth and things like that. There's like, it's just therapists saying, like, I'm willing, I'll keep some people on my caseload that are at that rate.
Great. And the only things I would add too is, since this is through GAU, I'm assuming most of the people watching this are probably graduate assistants. So I'd say also there are resources out there. Yes, some of them are, overwhelmed right now, like the CWC, just because of the pandemic and everything else going on in the world right now. It's just hard for them to meet all the needs, particularly as grad students, because we know from research, right, that grad students have a much higher risk for various mental illnesses like anxiety, depression. And so, yeah, check with the CWC first is one thing, just because the free resource that exists, they do have people there whose entire jobs are to refer people out. So you don't have to go there expecting to get help there. We can go there to get pointed in a direction to go in.
Yeah.
And also, if you are enrolled in the theater grad care, there's also Talkspace that offers free therapy for us. And then as far as I've been told, it's still supposed to be unlimited for graduate assistants if you're under theater grad care. So we'll be sharing all those resources at the end as well, or through the links or the GAU website later as well. So I think the next question would be, let's say you do find a therapist. For people who haven't been to therapy before, I have no idea what we do. Like, what could they expect in that first session? It can probably be pretty scary, right? Going in, meeting a stranger and not knowing what to expect. So if you just walk through kind of that process from like contacting a therapist to like the end of that first session, what kind of happens?
Start. So oftentimes a provider or therapist will offer an opportunity to have a consultation. So that might be either on the phone or in office. It depends kind of what the comfort and sort of the, structure or circumstance of the particular setting that you might be attempting to access therapy. And so oftentimes in that consultation process, it won't be like a full entire session, maybe between 10 and 20 minutes, depending on the provider's discretion. And that's an opportunity for you to get to know the provider, ask the questions that you really want to ask. I always like to say to folks who are looking for or desire working with a therapist that you get to be very selfish, and this is a process and experience that you should be leading with your intuition, your heart, the needs that you need met. And so in a lot of ways, like you really do hold sort of the power, and you are allowed to sort of put your expectations forward and choose who you are potentially going to open up to and sort of give the gift of your lived experiences to that particular person. And so oftentimes after the consultation process is that the therapist also sort of, from an ethical standpoint, might go through their own assessment to decide whether or not you might be sort of in scope of what their practice and what their training experience might look like. And so if it becomes a fit and a mutual sort of acceptance experience, then you might sort of really then at that point decide to engage in your very first session. So maybe I'll let some of my peers maybe talk about that first session experience, but I kind of wanted to highlight the consultation piece and sort of the self-advocacy that I always sort of tell people to keep in mind.
Well, I think in the first session, the therapist and the client, they are going to talk about the background, the history, just like Nia said, doing maybe a kind of assessment to see if the therapist and the client are a good fit. Also, I think it's important to establish in the first session goals. I think this is really super important in making agreements between the therapist and the client. And
Yeah,
Yeah, something that was coming up for me is how it can look very different based on the setting that you're going to. So for example, like practicing in a community crisis setting where we did not diagnose, the first session was very much immediately being able to like make that connection and potentially diving into like goals and getting to know each other and doing the work. Whereas when I was in a private practice setting that mostly billed insurance, in order for you to bill insurance, we do have to provide a diagnosis by the end of the session. So what that means is that within that setting, my intake sessions were much more question heavy. And that is not necessarily how I necessarily am as a therapist in other sessions. And so also wanting to have that conversation with people that, hey, you know, I have 45 minutes to talk to you and I have to provide a diagnosis by the end of that time. So today might be a little more crunch. Today might be a little more question heavy. And I want you to know this is not how all of our sessions work. So just sort of being mindful going in of like how that billing process might be impacting your experience as well.
Also, sorry, it's because I am not from here, but in the first session in the United States, if you are going to pay with your insurance, it's very, could be very often that some part of the session you are going to be talking about payments and papers or that kind of thing.
Yeah, the informed consent piece, because ideally, like when you're starting kind of that therapeutic relationship with somebody of wanting to make sure that everybody's on the same page, right, in terms of confidentiality, but also in terms of billing and payment to make sure this is going to be something that they can do. Because I bring up the confidentiality because when you're billing your insurance has access to certain information. So one thing that insurance will require is going to be a diagnosis code that is ordered to bill the services. They have to say, why are you going there, right? So I have to provide a diagnosis. The other piece to that is that insurance companies can request potentially like more further information from your therapist or even up to therapist notes. It's not very common, and it's typically going to be like more of a last resort piece. And like being able to have that conversation around what my limits of confidentiality look like. Just because if you are using insurance is considered like a, what's the word, third party provider. And so what that means is that they then have access to certain pieces around like your treatment and what that looks like.
Yeah, so I just want to pause here and highlight some terms that like we use so often and we maybe really don't stop to think, okay, what does this really mean if we go outside the field? Like you mentioned, like informed consent and limited confidentiality, and those are both critical pieces of the first session and really should be a part of the ongoing conversation in every session afterwards. So I just want to stop and kind of highlight, like, what does the informed consent mean? You can kind of guess from those words and put them together what they might mean, but what does it mean in the context of therapy? And then, like, as far as the limits of confidentiality too, like what that means for people who have never been in therapy before. Yeah.
I know you're really passionate about informed consent.
I got a lot of feelings for consent.
How would you like to define that?
Okay. Informed consent means that we are ideally taking this kind of power differential that's happening in the room, where I as the therapist know like what to expect or what's going on, and you as the client like are coming in and don't know these things. And my job is to make sure that we can get on the same page and that we are on the same page with knowing these things, right? It sets up so that my limits that I'm aware of when I might have to break your privacy, right? That idea of having legal confidentiality is that I cannot talk about any of your personal and private information with anyone outside of the room that is not for specific medical purposes, such as insurance or such as consultation. And for example, in the state of Florida, I do need to break confidentiality if there's imminent and immediate threat to somebody's well-being. Right? And that feels really important to address them with clients because many people experience suicide. Most people in their lives will have thoughts of suicide. And I don't want any of my clients to feel shut down in the session and not be able to disclose that to me because they hear that piece about confidentiality and think, oh, if I say that I'm suicidal, you're going to break my privacy, you're going to call the police. Right? And so the purpose of informed consent is for us to be able to have conversations around like, well, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And then I say imminent, immediate threat means that you and I have talked about it and we have not found collaboratively a way to keep you safe. Right? And I bring those pieces in, and the reason that I have so many feelings about it is that I think that informed consent, in the same way that informed consent around sexuality, which are conversations that are often held more often involves that idea of like personhood, that idea of autonomy, that idea of like, these are my boundaries, these are my choices that I get to make. Providing informed consent to the client is a way of saying, these are the boundaries, this is where they're at, this is your choice that you get to make around what you do or do not share with me.
Mm-hmm. And stacking on the confidentiality pieces of imminent and immediate threat, was that the word that you used? You did an amazing job of talking about like suicide and those pieces too. And there's the extension of that of harm yourself or others and vulnerable populations. So these include children or the elderly or those with disabilities who are not able to like take care of themselves. Those are other legal reasons why we would have to like break to make like a child services call and say there's something happening here. And again, like Corinne was saying, like with conversation and understanding what we're talking about, especially vulnerable populations, it definitely gets as like from an advocate and like a public safety and like maintaining the safety of people and children and people who can't do that for themselves, who can't advocate for themselves. There's that those legal pieces.
Yeah. I was just going to add, like, to think about sort of informed consent. It's certainly, in my sort of view, legal obligation, sort of the ways in which you might build or establish the space in which you practice therapy, but it also is like actual documentation. So, like as a client, when you come in, these are written sort of ideals and expectations that. You know, as a potential client, you will be required to sort of sign, and that's so. I think it was just important to point out that it is sort of conversational and the expectations of like practice, but also there is sort of like the written obligations as well, and the expectation that you sort of read through what that might look like for you.
Making sure you read those documents that you're signing when it's a lot, but they're there for most of them are there for really good reasons.
Yeah. Well, in my country, we do not have informed consent, so I think that, that is super different. But what I can see is that having this document is, you can share power with your client. And I think that is the most important thing, because in Mexico, people can go to therapy and they do not know actually if the person is a therapist, what kind of credentials they have, and what is going to happen in the session. So having this paper, I think, is something important in order to share power and really to understand what is going to happen with your therapy process.
We're going to come back to the power dynamics in a minute. Husnia brought it up a couple questions ago. I was like, I'm going to come back to that. And then also you had mentioned something that aligns so much with one of the next questions. You said, finding a good fit. And I wanted to elaborate on like, what does that look like? Like, how can you tell? And I'm going to say probably some of us have sat in both chairs, right? We've been a counselor and been a counselor ourselves. So how do you know when it's a good fit? And also highlighting the empowerment piece of like, as a client, what can you do if you feel like it's not a good fit?
I do not want to hear like mistake, but I think when your therapist is a good fit, when you can feel this connection, when you feel heard, when you feel respected, and when actually I think that the kind of approach that the therapist is going to use, you think is going to be really beneficial for you. But more than that, I think listening. When you really feel that the other is listening to you, if you can feel that, like, maybe I don't know at all what you are going to do or your therapeutic approach, but I feel relief and I feel listened for her.
What comes up for me is that a therapeutic relationship is a relationship. It is a professional relationship and it is a relationship. And so in some ways, figuring out a good fit is also going to be sort of figuring out a good fit for other people in your life, right? Like, is this somebody who I feel safe around? Is this somebody who I am able to share with and be vulnerable and for that to feel okay with me? And I think part of a piece that probably goes into goodness of fit, but is also going to intersect with other pieces related to that, like the ongoing relationship is like, how do you feel comfortable approaching them in the space to say like, actually, like this didn't feel good, right? And I say that because it is a human relationship, the therapist will probably not hit it out of the park every single time. And then how do you give that feedback? Is this somebody who I feel safe enough to give feedback to, go like, ooh, that didn't feel very good, right? Or, oh, this isn't helping me. So that in doing so, your treatment can then be tailored to what you do want it to be. And I think it goes back to what you were saying, Nia, about like that sense of being selfish, like this is my time, this is my space as a client, of like ideally someone who you can have that safety to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, if you feel like your therapist is going to get upset with you because you challenge them or like say that they did something that you didn't like, there's probably like a gut, maybe like a potential gut thing in there that's saying like this isn't a safe relationship to be in. And you can explore that for like, how is this mirroring other relationships in my life? Like you can go into all the therapy pieces of that, but that's not the job of the space. So like that's kind of that way of knowing when it isn't maybe a good fit for you. You kind of notice your own reactions to the person that you're trying to work with and you're supposed to be feeling safe with.
Yeah, and Corinne started to sort of talk to it, but some of the action pieces, I know Shay, you mentioned like the experience of being empowered to do something if you are, as Wakina was describing, like your own reactions or like maybe an internal experience where you feel like there's an incongruence happening. And I always say it's not uncommon, first of all, to feel like you are obligated to establish a tolerance for discomfort, if maybe you have disconnect or you notice that things are shifting, specifically an observation of power. Sometimes clients are like, well, I'm not the one that's, the professional, like I'm here to seek help and sort of to be vulnerable. And so I think it can be very easy to blur the lines of when can I sort of exercise my power and my ability to no longer consent to receive services from the person that I might be experiencing harm or disconnect. And I think it's important to emphasize like clients don't have to stay in dynamics or stay within therapeutic relationships that don't feel safe, that no longer feel safe. And so listening to your intuition and some of that internal messaging that Gina was kind of talking about, and it's okay to no longer continue and have that conversation. Whatever feels the most safe way to sort of conclude that relationship or experience is what you're entitled to. So,
you guys are like on it. Everything you're saying is tying into all these questions I have. So like the next one was highlighting client rights. Rights might be kind of a stronger word, but another way of saying is just expectations. What can clients expect of their therapist and what rights do they have? So really like highlighting that empowerment piece and being really client-centered. What would you, as a therapist or as someone who's been a client yourself, what would you like people who've never been in therapy to know as far as their rights or expectations?
I want to take the words you've been saying on for it, like it depends. Sometimes, and not on the rights, but like the expectations of like what you're expecting you're in a session, or like it depends on what kind of therapist you're seeing and like the work that they do and the work that you want to do. So like the what of the therapy can look very different. As in like just basic like client rights of like what you can expect. I think we've kind of been talking about it pretty in these previous questions of like being respected, being heard. Especially when you're working with a counselor, as far as I understand, like, and I am, is you're not going to be told what to do. Like if you're going to counseling to look for someone to tell you what to do, you're probably not maybe in the right place. There are other professions out there that will do that for you. But counselors are relationship builders, and their empowerment. They're people to empower you to make and do the things in your life and hold space for you to, while you're carrying some things, so you can do that. So I think that's a big piece of being able to kind of like expect that your story will be held and that you will be empowered to have the autonomy to do or not do in your life what you are looking for.
I think more than that, I have a question because I am sure that is different from from here to my country, and maybe some people who is listening, they will have the same question. Do clients have the right to see their diagnosis? Do people have the right to see their records?
And their health records.
I think it's like, my understanding is that yes, because they have to consent to diagnosis in most cases, and the exceptions to that are going to be in cases where like immediate threat or like somebody's like rights have been sort of like terminated in that, like if somebody else has like legal care over who can consent to mental health care decisions. It's not a very common thing to happen, but there are cases where you're not able necessarily to access your own records because you've been deemed as not fit to legally make decisions or care for yourself. And I would say the caveat is like, yes, like typically legally there is like your right to your records, and also like being able to hold like the ethics of like how does this diagnosis impact somebody? Like what does sharing this diagnosis potentially do to their treatment outcomes and like what's going on with them? Because I just think of other scenarios during some of my training where a client would request like specifically like their therapeutic notes and having conversations around like what was motivating that and like concerns surrounding like how that could potentially impact somebody to see parts of their own story written down, especially when like so much of our work might be depending on theory, but I'm thinking of like narrative theory of counseling where we're retelling stories, we're making shifts, right? But then to see it written down in that kind of sort of like physical, like eternal way of however that note was written and how that can potentially also do harm. So I know that's very complicated, but I'm just thinking of like the moving pieces, like legally and ethically within that.
Yeah, and so you're right that like there are some exceptions. The standard answer is like, yeah, in most cases as a client, you always have the right to request your records, but that doesn't mean that we give over the entirety of our records as they are. A lot of times that will initiate a conversation with the therapist. We'll be like, well, you know, what's the purpose of this? And having like more a conversation, because sometimes you don't need the actual records. Usually you want to know something. Hopefully you have a good relationship with your therapist, right? And you can just ask and they'll be transparent with you. I'm trying to think what else. So sometimes too, I want to separate that like there's different, I love documentation. You guys know that about me. So like I could do a whole talk on just this. But like as therapists, we usually have two documentation systems. We kind of have like an informal system for ourselves. I know I used to use Post-it notes all the time, where I just write like a keyword to kind of jog my mind for later, versus my like official record keeping notes. And a lot of our job as therapists is to navigate that, knowing that at any point, not only you as a client, but maybe like a legal system could access those notes at any time. And so a lot of our job is considering, okay, who could potentially access this? What am I writing? Would the client be okay with what I'm writing, right? And we have all of those processes on our end that we have to work through. The question was client rights or expectations. And I guess maybe some context around why I wanted to ask this question is I'm in a lot of like online spaces that include a lot of therapists, and a lot of times people who aren't therapists will come into those spaces to like ask questions of therapists. And a lot of times it will be because something is going really wrong. Usually to another question after this, but you know, I'm thinking of times where maybe someone has shared like, oh, my therapist is 15 minutes late all the time, and they still charge me the full price, and I feel bad about it, but I don't know what to do. And all of us as therapists are online are like, that's not okay, right? You should be able to expect your therapist to like honor your time together, right? And it's fair to have a conversation with them or even terminate the relationship, right? Or, you know, in some cases, I'll see therapists say, you know, here's how you can file a complaint with the board or whatever the next steps are, depending on what it is. And so this kind of goes back to like the client empowerment piece of like, what is okay or not okay? Because a lot of people don't know what therapists can
Go. I was thinking that termination is a right that the client has. If I do not feel comfortable, if I do not feel that this is making progress in my life, I then have the right to say I do not want to continue. And this is, I don't know, this is going to be my last session if that is what I decide. because I have heard so many stories, like really not here, in another place. But counselors trying to keep the clients like, oh no, you cannot terminate because this is going to be really detrimental for your mental health if you finish this relationship, blah, blah, blah. So I think there is something important to highlight. Client has the right to terminate the relationship, and if it is necessary, to have a consultation with another counselor or psychologist about how he or she is feeling about it.
I would say boundaries. Boundaries, you are allowed to have boundaries. Your therapist can ask a question about trauma history, and you can say, I am not ready to answer that question. Just because a question is asked does not mean you have to answer it. Your stories are your stories, and you get to decide how, when, and with who you share that with, if anyone. And then I'm going to say the really basic thing. You have the right to not be sexually harassed or have any sort of sexual moves made towards you by your therapist. It is like very 101. One of the very first things we learned in school is like, you do not sleep with clients. And I'm saying that because like, if you ever are getting that energy in a session that is wildly inappropriate, that should not be happening, and just sort of wanting you to have like, you have the right for that space to not involve that in any way, and it should not involve that in any way because of the power differential that can be present and the potential for abuse.
Yeah, this can be one I can go to. I didn't have it on the list at all, but my mind always goes back to the representation of counselors in media, right? Like, if you watch a show on Netflix or a movie or something, how poorly therapists are portrayed that the sexual relationship is usually the most common one.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it seems to be pretty common here in Florida.
Of ethical violations.
Yes, and also like that's the worst case scenario and how much that happens. So, but there are all these other, there are all these other things that happen as well. The kind of, you can make time. You aren't required to have a conversation with your therapist about it either.
On the other end of boundaries that I'm thinking about too, just like kind of expectations of like what the therapist boundaries might be. Typically, counseling hour is 50 minutes, like pretty traditionally, or if it's a couples counseling session, maybe like 90. It really just depends on what the norm of the that person and what they do. And your therapist will likely and should have boundaries around communication. With you as a client and for your safety and for protecting themselves as well, like self-care of themselves. And like when we're at work, and when we go home, we're at home, unless you're a crisis counselor and you're on call depending on your population that you work with. So if you text or email your counselor at like 9 p.m., they might not get back to you for 24 to 48 hours, especially if that's like a part of that informed consent. I'm not an on-call counselor. And pieces like that. Also, just to point out, like the email isn't confidential. I'm not sure if that's like a known fact. But if you share any information over the email, you don't ever share anything confidential information. Do that through like a private messaging system that the therapist should have in some capacity. And then if you're doing telehealth, like secure telehealth, like HIPAA compliant, confidentially compliant, safe softwares to be doing that. So that none of this information can be like pulled up in public records or anything like that.
And part of the other thing too I'm thinking of is, yes, we're professionals, right, and we have boundaries and we can respond within 24 to 48 hours, which is reasonable. On the other hand, I've heard stories of like counselors who don't get back to people for like 2 weeks, and like how completely unprofessional and unhealthy that is, right? So like having similar expectations, I guess, of what you expect of like a doctor or like some other professional, right?
Definitely.
Any other client rights or expectations?
Expect to be challenged. If you're going to therapy and you have something that you want to work on, like it should feel safe. Again, going back to those pieces that we talked about earlier, and I think it is also a fair expectation that there may be moments where it's like, this might be like a slightly uncomfortable question. right? And I would actually argue that part of the work can be being able to differentiate between uncomfortable and unsafe. Because sometimes something that is outside of our growth edge can feel uncomfortable, and it should never feel unsafe.
That's a good point that I like too, that we're not, professional yes people, right? We're not getting paid just to validate, all of your experience and maybe the way things are, because that's not what you're.
That's where the goals, like Isabel was talking about on that first session, are so important. Like, these are the things that you and we have to read on, like, are not working, or we want to be exploring, and can you lean into this relationship with me and do some of the hard questions and the pieces.
Also, I think that Ryan has the right to be involved in the treatment plan. Like, I would like to do this is something that I don't like, this kind of exercise really don't go well with me. Like, being actively involved in the treatment, that is also a right.
It kind of, and I know we'll talk about like theories and stuff in a second, but just, from like a narrative perspective, I am really big on co-creation and, the collaboration, like this was talking about. This isn't, I decide something and I apply it to you. This is, we create something, we create an experience that, where you can access healing, but you're very much so involved. And really, again, it depends on, the therapist style or the orientation or approach, but for me personally, I very much so, from a feminist and narrative perspective, like try to sort of not engage in as many power experiences as I possibly can and emphasize the collaboration. And I also think that I just want to highlight the expectation that you can understand and that it's digestible for you. I think sometimes clinicians can use jargon or terms or describe different aspects of treatment that as a person that is seeking treatment, you're obviously not trained to understand what that looks like. So having the expectation of accessibility and also interpretation of the treatment that you are participating in, I also think that's a right and an expectation that you should have, as a physician of your therapist.
Yeah, we'll circle back to the approaches of therapy in just a minute. I did want to highlight more since we're talking about, client empowerment and their rights. What should someone do if they have a legitimate issue with a therapist? Let's say you need more than just a misunderstanding of, I felt like I didn't really like it, said that or something, but it's truly something is going wrong. What can clients do? Terminating is one option that we point out as a possibility. Are there other options?
You can report to their supervisor and or report to the board, depending on severity and how we want to take it. Within every state has their own state licensing board, which issues our licenses to practice. In the state we have licensed mental health counselors. Because of Florida Sunshine state laws, everything is super public records. So you can just go on there and you can search for your therapist's name and bam, there's their licensure information. And on the board's website, it's very easy to file a complaint. And these are individuals who take this very seriously. Yes, and they will investigate the claim. They will look into it and get in touch with you. And if something needs to happen, if that provider no longer needs to have a license and you practice in seeing clients, then they have the power to take that away. Other pieces to keep in mind is that if you're within a larger institution, but also going above that person's head is still an option. Just thinking of hospitals or community centers where there may be somebody's boss who doesn't know that that's happening at all either. Which is kind of why I put the and piece in there. It can also be good in terms of the short term, immediate action of letting somebody who's on site who is also practicing know what's going on.
Because once you're licensed, you don't have a supervisor. So Mia and I are registered interns, so we have supervisors that are licensed people through the state and they have special qualifications. You wouldn't do that. And once you finish your licensure and you become a fully licensed therapist, then you're kind of out there doing your thing. So that kind of like power structure sometimes is still present in their entire practice, sometimes it's their own supervisor. So understanding like a hierarchy, like, oh, here's something, I was just thinking about this. So like maybe in that first session or part of all of these pieces of asking, like, who is your supervisor? Like asking your therapist, like, who is that? Do you have one? Like, what do you report to? Like being able to understand the power structure that you are, like that your person is a part of. So you have the resources for advocacy and is needed.
So close. Your counselor, I would like to having really direct communication about what you like, about what you don't like. There is an idea of resolve kind of misunderstandings. Working information, maybe that could be something important, and I am thinking, I'm sorry, I was thinking, sorry. And I was thinking because the United States is a very diverse country. Maybe we will have some international people that they will not understand, or they will need to have more clear information about something that can create some kind of misunderstanding. So I really think having very clear communication that can help, and they were talking at the beginning of this conversation, trust, and really establishing trust that will help to resolve misunderstandings. The relationship, the therapeutic building of a good therapeutic relationship that will help you.
Yeah, that's a good point too. And some of this might be driven too with the location of like where you're receiving therapy. Because I know a lot of places I work will have a written, it's called like a grievance procedure or policy. And usually the first step is if you feel safe to try to have a conversation with the therapist and let them know, hey, I don't feel like this is good. Usually the next step is to go to a supervisor, either for licensure or someone who's over them at the site. And then of course the board is always an option to discuss as well. So we'll circle back now to the different approaches to therapy. I guess we'll start like a round robin. I'll probably have a couple of these questions for you all, just so briefly, if you could share maybe just one approach that you use to therapy, just to explain, because sometimes if you're looking for a therapist, you might do like CBT or EMDR or all these acronyms or just theories that don't mean anything. So for someone who's not familiar with therapy at all, what is like one approach to therapy that you might use, and just kind of break it down and explain in a way that makes sense to someone.
Narrative therapy, I do a lot of narrative therapy, that this is a post-modern approach. And narrative therapy tries to challenge the normative discourses of what is a disorder, a mental health disorder. The counselor will create a safe and collaborative space to re-narrate. Is correct to say re-narrate or to say narrate? To
Reiterate.
Yeah, like re-narrate.
Exactly, with their story, in trying to find new discourses that are going to be much more beneficial for the client. This means all the time we are involved in discourses of power, and these discourses of power create what is mental health. Narrative therapy is based in Michel Foucault's ideas, who is a French philosopher who all the time is challenging all these kinds of systems of power. So narrative therapy tries to create a liberation for the client, and in the act of creating new narratives, the person can find other identities that are more aligned with what they want to be and what they want to create about themselves. So I think this approach is really beautiful because don't put a cap like, oh, you are a depressed person, oh, you are an anxious person. It is like how depression or the word depression, the fact depression is making your life happen. Because yourself is another thing. You are not the path. The path are these courses of power. So yes, Locality therapy is the approach that are more used and that I really think creates liberation and liberation in clients.
Laura. Okay, that's kind of debate. I think I will just kind of do a break for like maybe a couple therapy and not the systemic dynamics of that. So there's a lot of different kinds of couples therapy that you always see. There's a lot of these, like there's inherited couples therapy, there's like kind of an non-belief of many different things that are careful. But essentially, couples therapy takes a look away from the individuals in the system in like a couple or a family, because we say family also, and looks about the patterns that are happening in a relationship. So there's a zoom away from like the internal person to like how is everybody relating, creating patterns and cycles that are like healthy or unhealthy, helpful or unhelpful, creating dysregulation and things like that. And there's a lot of different ways to work with that. The therapy that I tend to use the most within couple systems is called emotional focus therapy. And what that therapy modality looks like is how is the emotional attunement in each person and to each other impacting the emotions in the relationship that is then impacting behavior. So when we are in relationship with each other, we're kind of like, and when we're in maybe an unhealthy pattern, we're kind of like smashing into each other and acting in ways that are not helping our relationships be beneficial, be safe, secure for us. And if we can take a look, they call it the dance of the relationship. When we feel a certain way, then we act a certain way, and then that feeds over to our partner or somebody else, and then they feel a certain way, and then they act a certain way, and we can get into this really unhealthy dance. And figuring out like, okay, how do we pause that dance and try something a little bit different? And then see how the emotions in that system change in you and the other person, so then we can shift how this relationship feels. So it feels like we're actually like waltzing together rather than in this like chaos and we're stepping on each other's feet. But it does take a lot of that emotional tone and using emotional language, teaching people about emotional language. A lot of us are not taught. We're very, especially in America, we tend to be very head-heavy people. We're thinking about our feelings rather than feeling our feelings. And that I can mean that from the heart and literally in our bodies, feeling our feelings. That ties into like a lot of the trauma pieces that I really enjoy too. But from the couples therapy and the emotionally focused pieces about the zoom out. And within, for me anyway, and I think a lot of couples therapists do this too, is asking individuals to be an individual therapy if they can, if they're able to, because couples work and family work brings up a lot of stuff. And that is really important too. And knowing, so you can work in power, if there are power dynamics in a relationship, then you have an individual therapist who can kind of process that and figure out who this relationship wants. Is it a healthy relationship that I want to continue to be a part of, and how does that look? So for me, it tends to be like a double layer. But I usually will do the couples work, and then they'll be referred out. Usually they'll see things like this other couples.
So I think first I want to start by saying like approach and theories and everything. I think it really depends on how you're trained. I know for me, like in my master's program, I was really trained to be intentional to be an integrated therapist, which most of us are. But you know, there are some people that practice what we would feel like a purist, where they are very, very skilled and intentional about conceptualizing and practicing under a particular umbrella of not only sort of theoretical frameworks, but also, again, interventions and things like that. So the one that I wanted to talk about in the context of theory is feminist theory or feminist therapy. So like narrative, feminist is also considered what we would say like a postmodern approach to counseling or therapy. And for me, the way that I, really view and think about feminist therapy is not only, number one, to situate or emphasize the strengths of the client, and so it's very client-focused and strengths-based in nature, but it particularly focuses on the reclamation of certain experiences when we talk about sort of systemic oppression. I think that approach to therapy will emphasize the reclamation of being disempowered and being able to view your experiences in a very non-pathological context, but rather sort of a cultural or social context of the ways in which you have experienced oppression or harm in the context of your lived experience. So I think oftentimes when people think of feminist therapy, they might make assumptions, right, about kind of the name of it, the application, does it fit? And, I always am the first person to sort of debunk and dismantle some of the prejudgment that comes with just hearing sort of the phrase, because I think it applies to everyone, right? We are all oppressed in some ways and are trying to experience some kind of liberation, but also reclaim our experiences that, whether it's in a traumatic experience or, social harm, we can sort of reclaim. So I think I'll stop there, kind of ramble, but that's how I conceptualize and apply feminist therapy in my work.
So I'm also a very integrative therapist, but I wanted to talk about CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, because it is often one of the more popular ones. Recently, often if you Google therapy, people will be like, oh, CBT, and it's had a lot of research done on it, and in particular, that's because it is a more manualized approach. So CBT is also known as a medical model. So what that means is that in terms of how that therapeutic relationship is often conceptualized, is that the therapist, similar to a doctor, is somebody who you go see, and they provide a diagnosis that this is the thing that I'm concerned about and that I'm seeing that is wrong, and then provide exercises that are going to help you challenge different thought patterns as well as different behavior patterns that you may already have ingrained that may be contributing to whatever diagnosis that you're presenting with. I was thinking earlier about the therapists don't tell you what to do, and it's like, well, sometimes they do a little bit, especially if there are going to be pieces. CBT is also known for having homework assignments of things that you're going to be working on in between sessions. And oftentimes it's looking at those sort of core roots of what is going on in these thoughts, right? Kind of listening as the client is talking in a session, I'm hearing this, where does that come from? And three of the main sort of underlying roots that it looks at is going to be helplessness, worthlessness, and unlovability. And trying to really target those roots and see how can we unlearn some of these patterns that are reinforcing these negative self-beliefs.
I'm timely. I think 2 more questions I want to make sure that we get to, so we're going to do a little bit quicker. Round robin, so this might be it's going to be a little more challenging. About maybe 30 seconds. So my next question would be to identify one barrier to accessing therapy, it could be one reason why you think maybe it's harder for people to go to therapy, and you speak to that barrier, how would you address it, or how do you impact people? Quick acknowledgement of all the reasons why sometimes we don't get to see people.
One barrier is the necessity for billing insurance to provide the diagnosis. This can go in several ways. For students who are still on their parents' insurances, often they don't want that breach of privacy to happen, and depending on the insurance company, it depends on your ability to potentially stop the explanation of benefits from going to the parent. The other pieces that come up with that are going to be certain professions. Law school comes to mind, military comes to mind, have certain pieces that go along with if you do have a diagnosis and you carry that you can be prevented from entering the field or completing your school.
Or even being a therapist. Sometimes there are some states that prevent therapists who have mental health diagnoses from being therapists.
For me, the one that comes up is cultural influence, particularly, in certain communities. There's still communities of color specifically. The stigma around what that process looks like. For certain cultures and families, the expectation is very internalized. We don't expose like suffering. We don't expose that there are problems, and so maybe perhaps the cultural messaging and the expectation of what it would mean to ask for help and try and sort of I'll leave it at that. That'd be a barrier.
You kind of like about shame and stigma was like the big one. And then I think so on that one. So I was thinking like just accessibility through like financially, like I was saying earlier, like average counseling costs, like if you're paying out of pocket $150 for 50 minutes. And then even just being able to, if you're not doing telehealth, being able to drive to a therapist's office and pay for gas, financial accessibility.
How do you say, like if I walk or I'm here, if I have a disability that is contributing to career yes, and also maybe another barrier is that there are hundreds of models, and I have told clients like, I don't know really where to go or with, because there are so many approaches and there are so many models that I am just paralyzed and I cannot make the decision. Like there's
Yeah, so to speak to like a couple of these, right, the ability to pay and like disabilities and things is, advent of like telehealth in the last few years. On the one hand, has made things more accessible, but I'm also thinking of like areas being like, if you live in a rural area, a lot of them still don't have the infrastructure to even have telehealth, right? And so that's a big barrier too, right? Yeah, or sometimes in some places even like not having good satellite coverage or not good like cell phone service where they can use telephone, right? Unless they're like standing in a certain part of the property or what have you. And so I do just want to remind anyone who's watching, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat at this time. I have one last Robin question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So the last question I have for you all, and I guess I'll have to do this kind of one-on-one real quick, is tell me the difference between a psychiatrist and a counselor.
Well, the psychiatrist gives medication. The psychiatrist is allowed to give medication. The counselor does not. I think it's like this in English.
Yes.
Counselors, psychologists, and social workers, they do not prescribe.
Oh, great.
Yeah, that's the thing. Tell me the difference between a counselor and a social
They're very similar. Social work has been around as a profession for a lot longer than like counseling and psychology. So they have a lot of influence, particularly around policies and then like the government and things like that. Social workers can do clinical work and they are trained to do clinical work just like counselors are. They're also trained to do a lot of case management and like work within hospitals and places where particularly they do a lot of community work, like helping people find access within the community, access to resources and things like that you'll find in hospitals. They're the ones who, how can we help? Like what's around here that your family might need or things like that. That's kind of the big
just to be on some of the differences, right? Because some of these jobs can look the same and something hard to know what are they doing. Tell me the difference between a counselor and a psychologist.
Yeah, so for one, the training is very different, and that's from a clinical perspective and also from an educational perspective. But a lot of psychologists, their training is not necessarily therapeutically focused. they more sort of train in sort of assessments, instrument use, the application or evaluation of disorders, clinical experiences, etc., and how do we sort of correct or address those from sort of again an assessment instrument diagnostic perspective.
My friend who was totally different questions. So we have talked mostly from the perspective of the counseling a little bit. We have not talked about group counseling. So if you'd like to share a little bit about what that looks like or the groups that you're on,
Yeah, so group counseling is such a powerful modality in part because you're getting the benefit of having the therapist there as more of a facilitator role if you're in a process group, or you're getting the therapist there in more of an educator role if you're in more of a psychoeducation group. And so what these two different modalities can look like is often in more of a process-oriented group is going to involve sharing particular pieces, often related to whatever that group's focus is. So UF-GAU has a lot that are tailored to different areas of research. And then your peers or other individuals who are there in the group with you are going to be able to reflect back and pull that space and say, hey, what is it that you're looking for us? What can I do to keep that on? Right, and I think it can be so powerful because it really speaks that inner wisdom that all of us carry, because it means that all of the clients who are in that group counseling space get to both be able to have services being met for themselves while also being able to provide that feedback and acknowledge ways that they are capable. I don't know, I just think about self-esteem building that goes in there too. And then in terms of more psychoeducation groups, often I'm thinking of a DBT skills group. DBT is known as dialectical behavioral therapy. It's an offshoot of CBT that works a lot with emotional regulation and relationships with other people. And so it'd be very common for a DBT group. The largest that I've seen had 40 people in it. I know. It was intense. It was kind of a webinar. But it's very psychoeducation based, right? So the idea is they're going to be telling you, I think about there's one acronym of SNP that they use, and it goes through different pieces that you can do to help regulate your emotions when you feel sort of yourself going out of that regulated zone. Something can be as simple as splashing cold water on your face, right? Having a temperature change, going into any kind of exercise, breathing. And then there's also Deep Therapeutics is growing. And yes, I'm going to be running some D&D groups therapeutically this summer. So that is also, play therapy is a whole thing. We've not done it justice, but we can't in 1 hour, but just throwing that out.
1 hour is definitely not enough to even scratch the surface of what all we do. So we need to put it in future. So just more sessions for future. So we do have just a few minutes left.
For a lot of graduate students are parents, and there are local resources around play therapy. And like you were saying, we barely touched it. If that is a question or anyone needs resources, please feel free to reach out. That is a specialty of mine, and then I am connected in the community if you are able to kind of go over that for the kiddos, especially after the last 2 years. They need support in a lot of ways.
For sure, yeah. After Q&A, I'll try to do some time for any final thoughts. Do we have any questions?
I've not been able to check the Facebook because we're in an internet dead zone. So I'm going to do that right now, that I'm not worried about the this, but.
Oh, so I have a few questions. So what kind of accountability do counselors and therapists have, with this perspective of the reporting sort of issues? What does that process look like for therapists on that end?
For the accountability, do you just mean in terms of what confidentiality looks like, or do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so the follow-up process. What does that look like if I were to say, this may or may not be a real example, report a therapist that fell asleep on me during the middle of the session? Yeah.
I think that might be hard for us to speak to just because it's pretty unusual for something to fall asleep in the work. And of course, the clients have that right, that it's pretty again, the examples you see in the video and things that come out, and these are really just examples, but my understanding, because I did have one of my professors that had like one, and it's a formalized process. The board is made up primarily of peers who are also like, and they will do an internal investigation. They will contact usually the person who's there to get more information. They'll meet the person they think about and find out like what happened, what was the decision-making process, and what happens from there. As my understanding is, there's almost like a flow chart. Like there are steps. So if they think that the complaint was founded, then that starts the process. If it's unfounded, they'll close it out. So there's a whole tier. It continues to escalate. Worst case scenario is a counselor to lose their licensing or release someone.
Another thing I wanted to add is part of that is under some circumstances, depending on what the offense is the board will actually host hearings with the defendant is not trial, but
It feels like trial, like you go and
but yes, we'll host like actually a public hearing for the and under some circumstances they will decide on the spot what the status of your license, like whether or not it's revoked, suspended, etc. So as Shay alluded to earlier, it's very serious. Especially in Florida. State licensing board does not take complaints lightly, and the justice in terms of sort of the professional responsibility to remove the harmful provider is certainly followed through with very, very thoroughly.
And there's a state attorney at those meetings, who is designated specifically. But I think or the hearings, because we went for class, and watch, because they're public hearings, like they'll announce them and we can just kind of go and they do them for people who are trying to get licensed here from another state if they have any allegations against them in another state. So hey, we're talking about you're talking about this. No, you're not getting licensed yet. I saw that happen. So yeah, they are really so our board is called the 491 board, and it is over mental health counselors, parenting counselors, social workers, and psychology, So we have, and then there's additional ones that are similar umbrella.
I believe also, even if they are unfounded, it is all the picture about you say unrendered indefinitely what is there.
Do we have any more questions?
I have plenty of questions. I mean, this is just such a wonderful panel. I want to thank each and every one of you. It's really interesting. And so I guess one question I had was maybe grad students might be interested in this, like how does locality inform therapy, especially if they are maybe only here in Gainesville for like 2 years with a master's degree, or they only have a limited time. That can be kind of, I know someone who's moved around a bit, like, you know, it can be challenging sometimes to have a relationship with someone and have that end. So what does that maybe look like?
We live in a country where, for whatever reason, we decided it was the best idea for counselors to have licenses that have different requirements and only be statewide. So unfortunately, what that means is that if I have a client who I'm counseling and they move one state above me to Georgia, and if I were to see them via telehealth, I would be committing a crime and could be arrested because I'm practicing in Georgia without a license. And I say that just because, like, I think it is an area that I know the American Counseling Association is advocating for changing, and the National Board Certified Counselors are also advocating for changing. Like, our hope is to eventually get like national licensure so that won't happen. So that we can ideally, especially with teletherapy services being covered way more now by insurance after the pandemic, be able to see the state counselor. And in the meantime, I think what that means is having those conversations with the therapist in the get-go. Like, hey, you know, like, I'm only here for 2 years, so we're not going to be able to touch on all of maybe the things in my life I want to work on. I want to focus here. In these 2 years, when I leave Florida and I go back to whatever state, like, I want to focus them. right? And so it may just look like tailoring what that work looks like in the goals consistent with that form of patient.
It's brief therapy, and there are these different modalities of like brief therapy versus long-term. If you're at the CWC, you're seeing a counselor or psychologist there, it is a brief therapy model, for like 16 sessions, and then you end that relationship, and then you refer out to the community if you want to keep it working. So for these goals of, am I doing like my deep trauma work and years of therapy and settling in, or am I like wanting to work on my reactivity because I want to finish my master's program? So like how do I work on my anxiety? And that's that piece of the first session where you can have some conversations, and your therapist can help you decide like, okay, this is what seems manageable in this amount of time. What do you think about that? Or how do we kind of navigate this week so you can be your own advocate, be able to end the relationship well and when it has to happen. That's also a part of this is like, ideally, I don't know if this is just me, but like I'm trying to work myself out of a job. Like that's kind of the thing about it is we want you to be successful without us. If we are overly invested in keeping you as a client, like you were saying, that's an issue. And relationships so important, absolutely. And like having a positive relationship with somebody and maintaining a relationship with somebody, totally. I've been with my therapist for like 3.5 years now. So we're doing like really intense work together. And when she moves or if I move, like that would be okay, you know. So being able to talk about that and have like, your expectations of like, this is a professional relationship. This is a relationship we're working on you, and keeping that in mind as you're thinking about it.
And it's such a lovely way to practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And we are not taught how to do that as people.
Well, talking about ending well. Here's my thing. Yeah, I know we didn't get to a lot of questions. I didn't have any questions. If you feel free to email the health committee at you. We'll get back to you. The health committee is like always here to help if you have any questions back to some therapy or resources. That's what you're sharing as well. So to make sure we end on a good note, is there anything else?
Therapy.
Do it.
I would say that I think the first step, make a decision for therapy would be very, very difficult because we have so many stigmas about counseling and blah, blah, blah. But actually, it is really working. And if you have the idea in your mind that you need help, don't think about it and you go to help.
I was actually thinking that recently, like if you are here and you're watching this, taking the time, like there's something in you that's saying, like, this is something that I need. You're doing exactly what you need to do. It's really moving and impacting your life. You're feeling better for yourself, for your relationships and lives, for your family, and all of these things. So just trust that this kind of came across for you, and you were like, you're in this place for a reason.
Yeah, I would just add, just to remember that you're like deserving and worthy of having someone else like hold the lived experiences with you if they really feel, particularly distressing. Like you're worthy and deserving of that process and the opportunity to experience healing in that way. And I also want to emphasize that therapy can look a lot of different ways, and so I encourage everyone to remember it doesn't have to be this very Western, like traditional, mirrored process. There's a lot of opportunities to experience therapy in a way that preserves like your identities. So again, I would say lead with those expectations we talked about, and remember that there's a lot of creativity and opportunity to cultivate that process for you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome, everybody. I do have a